Someone sent an email out. I guess Europe has changed their clocks, but California hasn't yet.
Oh, did the clocks change?
Only in Europe.
Oh, okay.
Alex
Uh,
kindly sent
Someone
an
sent
email
an
out.
email out. I guess Europe has changed their clocks. We've stopped changing our clocks here, so I just have to adjust everyone else.
Great. Well, oh, hold on real quick. I need to change my preferences.
We're live whenever you're ready, Ashton.
I'll be right back. I have to leave. I had to enable the preferences and I have to close it and come back. So I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's see if it works this time. Good. All right. So we're covering lecture 10 in interdisciplinary astronomy today, as you all know. And so, as Steiner has in prior lectures, he emphasizes that what he's doing here, and it's clear in the title, even though I guess that wasn't the title when he was giving the course, but interdisciplinary astronomy, seeking for a more holistic, encompassing method of explanation. So in this short presentation, I'm just going to read some of the quotations that I've selected from the chapter that I think epitomize some of the wide-ranging points that he makes in this chapter, which I think of as a kind of culminating lecture, even though it's halfway through. There's just so much in this one. So he writes, or he says, when it's a question of explaining the phenomena presented by the compass needle, we go out of the region of the needle itself and try to enter into the totality with the elements that have been collected in search of an explanation. This is the only way we can explain phenomena that manifest themselves as a sequence of facts belonging to some totality. And so he says we need to approach our understanding of organisms in the same way as one would approach or conceive of the activity of the needle. And so that he criticizes the restriction of our attempt to understand biology to the microscope and excluding what's going on in the heavens. And so he begins concretely with the polarity of the radial bones. So he gives the example of the femur. So the inside of the tubular bones and the outside of the surface of the cranial bones. And so earlier in one of the lectures, he mentions that when we talk about inversion concretely, we have to take into account, in contrast to what we experience with a manufactured glove, which just turns inside and out, and pretty much it's just the mirror of the shape. Whereas with this more concrete metamorphosis or inversion of the tubular bones into the cranial bones, you have to take into account these inner stresses. That's what he, or surface stresses that he mentioned in one of the prior lectures. So he writes, or he says, you must consider the outer universe forming the outside of the human head and what works within, tending from within toward the inner surface of the tubular bone as related in their influence upon the human constitution. You have to see these as belonging together. You have to regard the world on the inside of the tubular bone as a kind of inversion of the world surrounding us outside. So this is sort of his preliminary example of polarity and as being that larger context, the polarity, as we'll see, of the radius and the sphere, for which we come to understand organisms and all the activities really that are going on in our experience. So he mentions that, let me bring up my notes, that the principle of metamorphosis as it first appeared in the work of Goethe and Oken has to be modified if it's to be applied with real understanding to the human being. The attempt was made, and it was made with genius on the part of Goethe, to derive the formation of the cranial bone from that of the vertebrae. So I don't know how much they knew. It seems they must have known a lot about embryology already in Steiner's time. But I'm also concurrently reading this book that you see referenced, Metamorphosis, Evolution in Action. Maybe some of you have read it, by Andreas Sukanki. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's a great book, and he goes into this sort of difference that we're able to, I guess, look upon the formation of the vertebra and the bones now that we know more about embryogenesis and know that the tubular bones and the bones of the cranium that are more in the front, they actually have a different origin in embryogenesis. So Goethe's basic intuition that the vertebra, as Sukanki writes here, however dimly, that the vertebra could be regarded as the archetypal element of the skeleton, not because all other bones were material identical to it, and therefore derivable from it, but because more clearly than any other parts of the skeleton, it unites the two formative polarities that elsewhere appear in a more or less one-sided fashion. So it's a kind of another nod to the pre-phenomenal powers of polarity shaping what will become the vertebra already in embryogenesis, and as it's sort of represented here, you can see that that there's like with the vertebrae that are closer to the head, there's a transformation that is anticipating the leap into the cranium, and vice versa with the vertebrae that are going down towards the coccyx. So just imaging this dynamic between the radius and the sphere. So then, he talks about this polarity between the tubular bones, the radial type bones, and the cranial bones as giving us a first glimpse of what he calls the true principle of metamorphosis. The other bones are intermediary. So if you just look at the blue bones in particular of the vertebra, intermediary formations, morphologically, they mediate between the two opposite extremes, which correspond to a complete inversion accompanied by a change in the forces determining the surface, so between the radius and the sphere. And then he says, in all the human organs, we have to distinguish between these two opposing factors, which, is nothing new for those of us who are familiar with Steiner and anthroposophy, this polarity. Something that works outward from an unknown interior, and something that works inward from without. And so these are the images from the lecture, where to the left, there's depicted the inner surface of the tubular bone, and then its correspondence with the outer surface of the cranial bone. And then to the right, to the far right, the way that he insists we need to think about the cranium being connected with this activity coming from the periphery of the cosmic sphere that he suggests we think about extending infinitely, in contrast to the movement that corresponds with our upright skeleton, in the radial bone, and that having a correspondence with the radius of the Earth. So he says, if we bring this terrestrial impulse, this radial Earth impulse, into a relationship with our consciousness of the sphere, if we observe how this polarity prevails in normal waking consciousness, we'll perceive that it's always there, alive within us, playing its part in our conscious life. Really, the connection between the forming of mental images and the life of the will can be studied only by considering the polarity between sphere and radius. So like everything is encompassed by these constitutive pre-phenomenal powers. And so we can talk about the tubular bone, the bones that reflect the radial activity, and then and likewise the sphere. And then we can also talk about what we experience in our everyday waking consciousness as our will and as perception and thinking. So then, he mentions the threefold constitution of the human being in connection with this. Therefore, we have to seek the result of the celestial activity in all that we bear and the systems associated with our head. And we have to seek what belongs to the earthward tending activity, as it were, toward the center of the earth. In the processes of our metabolism, it's as though they represent two one-sidednesses in the middle realm. The rhythmic realm mediates between them. And so when I said this lecture is really rich, he's not only talking about all these other disciplines that are illuminated by this deeper understanding of polarity, but also the evolution itself and human history. And which is a kind of recapitulation of what we see with an individual human development, starting with embryogenesis and then with birth and growing into adulthood. So he says, just as we take the Earth's magnetism into account in connection with the compass needle, so we have to observe in the polarity of sphere and radial activity in order to understand what is forming itself into an embryo, and which, when the embryo is born, then fades into the pictorial quality of the experience of consciousness. So this is another really fascinating aspect of this lecture that I think people familiar with Steiner, and especially the way he talks about child and human development, that the activity of the radius and the sphere is working in a plastic way on the embryo, and even in a way up to a certain point in childhood. And then what we experience as our, kind of thinking, waking consciousness is that plastic activity released for this pictorial quality of the experience of consciousness. And this is also another way of talking about the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of the Earth. And then there's this, really interesting part where he then starts talking about this dynamic between radius and sphere in our, in what we experience as our life of knowing, and that I guess the celestial activities mirror themselves in the earth, and there's a kind of invert. It's kind of confusing because he says it's actually the reverse at one point of the way he's describing it. So I don't really know how to understand that, but from the way he did describe it, he describes, yes, that there's like the celestial activity out on the periphery. Also, it's mirrored in the center of the earth, and then works its way out from the earth as well in mineral activity. That's the way I'm understanding it now. Maybe not, maybe not accurate. But so he says, in regard to the systems of the head, he's emphasizing that at this point in the evolution of consciousness, there's a restriction of our understanding to the mineral realm. He says, in regard to the systems of the head, we're organized from out of the celestial sphere. Therefore, what underlies the forces of the mineral kingdom must also be organized from the celestial sphere in some way. What's thus within you relates to what's in the mineral kingdom outside you, as an image relates to reality. And then again, this emphasis on the connection between the radial aspect of our being and the life of the will, and that being connected with what's really real, sort of in contrast to what is merely pictorial. And so that's really interesting to me. It's a question I have about like the sort of the unconscious character of our will, and then also the way in which our will is bound up with the will of the earth and all the mineral activity, I guess, in the earth. That's just an interesting question to me. And I'll wrap up with these last quotes that are so fascinating. He says, we can think of the whole celestial sphere as being mirrored in the earth. We conceive the mineral kingdom of the earth as a result of this reflection, and we conceive that what lives within us, enabling us to understand the mineral kingdom, comes from what surrounds us out in the celestial sphere. Meanwhile, the realities we grasp by means of this faculty of understanding come from within the earth. So, of course, also when he's talking about the mineral kingdom and our understanding of the mineral laws, I understand him to also be kind of speaking about the mechanistic physics. And then, he then extends this to, the human as microcosm, and says you need only to follow up this idea and then cast a glance at the human being, at the human countenance. And if you really look at the human countenance, you'll hardly be able to doubt that in it something is expressed of the outer celestial sphere. And this is, one of those esoteric images that connect the planets with the human form and the different sort of alchemical mineral elements. And then finally, another connection with history and evolution. Thus, we find a connection between what's outside us in outer reality and the structures in our own organism that give us the capacity to understand the outer reality. The cosmos produces the outer reality, and our power to understand this outer reality is organized physically by virtue of the fact that the effects of the cosmic sphere upon us are now limited to our cognitional faculties. So another reference to, a kind of macro process that's mirrors the individual development after embryogenesis, after the human is born. Therefore, we have to distinguish in the genesis of the earth as well between two phases. One, which I've described as the embryonic, in which active forces work in such a way that the real earth is itself created, and then a later phase of earth evolution in which the forces work so as to create the human faculty for understanding the realities. So I'm going to stop there. And Max, I know you have to leave early usually, so I want to give it to you real quick before you have to go.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Really appreciate that, Ashton. And I just wanted to pick up on two different points you made, and I'll do it in reverse order. About the polarity that Steiner established and that you were commenting on between the reality and the picture, or the like earth creating forces and then the forces of understanding in us. I was really intrigued by the comment that Matt made. It's right, I have to leave early, but I try to watch the rest of the discussions at a later time. Matt made this right at the very conclusion of last week's meeting about the creation of space. And the way I've come to understand that is in what Steiner's calling reality, that's actually our participation in space that's been created by the hierarchies. And we actually can have a sense for like the fallacy that Matt was pointing to, the idea that the space is just kind of inertly there. But rather it's being sustained in the same way that we sustain space in our imaginations when we envision something. So the pictorial quality of space, it becomes reality in the thought of the gods. That's the first comment that I make, and maybe you or somebody else will have more to say about it. And the second one is harkening back to what you brought up right at the outset of your summary, the human form, and that kind of the inversion, the turning inside out in the human form between suspended between this polarity of the head and cranium and then the limbs. One thing to consider is the head is actually it's like a more primordial form. It's an exoskeleton. We think of the human being as not possessing an exoskeleton, obviously, but that's only partly true. It's true in respect to our limbs, for instance, but it's not true in respect to our cranium and our head. And then what you see is by the time you arrive at the limb, that's been inverted, turned inside out, so that we have an endoskeleton in our limbs. But then just consider that the mediating, Steiner says this, the rhythmic pole mediates between them. But just consider the way that like the signature is manifest in the actual form of the body, the skeletal form. Just think about what think about what the rib cage looks like. It literally looks like 50-50. It's like partly endoskeleton, partly exoskeleton. So I think that's just kind of consolidating the point that you made already, Ashton, and that Steiner made. So I'll leave it there, and maybe somebody has more to say.
Thanks, Max. Go ahead, Jeff.
Hello. I have two general things to say. We've sort of gone over the ground through Ashton's summary, and Max, you kind of touched on it in some ways here too. My first reaction to this piece was while I was reading it. There's actually, I have it open right in front of me. There's the particular. I don't have to read the quote. Just the idea that when he's talking about the in the embryonic phase, that this polarity that we exist in is that much more intensified for us. So I'm reading this, and while reading it, this thought just pops into my mind. I didn't know where it came from or even who said it. You can kind of look around and look behind you and say, who said that? Such a thought. But the thought that popped, oh, I'm sorry, the section I was reading, when the polarity in the embryo and how that's so more intensive and real, at that phase for us, it's not faded off into the pictorial consciousness, in our later waking life. So I'm reading that, and the thought that pops into my mind is a name, and it's the name Anton Webern. Okay, well, as I say, I didn't know where the thought came from, but I know that name. That's an early 20th century German composer of the serialist tradition. That you don't need to know about all that, but I know about it because I had studied that in another lifetime, as they say, back when I was in music school, and I was very intensively studying all those kinds of composers and everything. And I was sitting there as I was reading Steiner with this thought, Anton Webern, and I'm saying, why the heck would the name Anton Webern pop into my head when I'm reading about the embryonic consciousness? And what occurred to me, I sat with that for a bit, is that that composer, those serialists, were I'll keep this very, very brief, but they were expanding the musical compositional vocabulary out to all 12 tones instead of what we're so used to of the 7 tones. All our pop music, all the classical music, whatever most of us would typically listen to is in that 7-tone world, which would be more of an earthly art form, and then the 12 Lorenzo. That's really fascinating what you just put in the chat. I didn't know that, but yeah, the 12 tones relate more to this cosmic realm, right? What he's talking about in the embryonic sphere. So out of all that, I thought, well, whatever that fad was of baby, what was it called, baby Mozart, or parents would play Mozart, to their child in the womb to hope the baby would turn into a genius. Well, I ended up thinking, well, maybe they should be playing Baby Webern, for the cosmic counterpart that babies would need at that phase. So that's my first general point. The second is on this business of our relationship to the mineral kingdom. How our consciousness relates to the grand cosmos, and Ashton, you were summarizing that. Where I know that from is in medical Heilkunst. We definitely see a direct correlation between the homeopathic remedies made from the mineral kingdom, calcium, silica, the whole range, and how that relates to the fourth body in human physiology, what we call the ontic, or I guess what Steiner calls the ego organization. There's a direct medical correlation to what he's talking about there. I just want to throw that point in. So that's about what some of the big points I took out of this lecture.
Thanks, Jeff. I also forgot to say, I didn't say much about the last couple pages. So Matt, if you wanted to, or if anyone else wanted to elaborate on that a little bit, or follow up on what has been said so far.
Well, I'm just thinking about the connection Steiner draws between, for us as adults now, our inner ideation and capacity for forming mental pictures, that when we were in an embryonic form, rather than this capacity for image making being internalized and kind of dulled, it was actually of a it was integrated with our very bodily development, that the forms that the embryo was taking was a kind of plastic, imaginative image forming process, and that gradually that gets internalized as we mature. And at the end of the chapter, when he's talking about this transition, because of our capacity to intuit the continuity of a Cassini curve as it moves through the various values of A and B, the ratios of A and B, to the point where you get those two seemingly separate curves that in two-dimensional space seem discontinuous, that in our intuition of the mathematics of it is actually continuous, just in a non-Euclidean space, where we have to go out of space to intuit that. He talks about the need for a kind of movement beyond just centric forces to understand our relationship to the heavens, and that what we see with our eyes on the earthly plane, we might superficially think is the same sort of process when we're looking up at the heavenly movements. But he says that that's to project what's relevant to the earth, where centric forces rule into the heavens, where these spheric or etheric forces are operating. And he talks about the need to develop a sense for the rotating, shearing, and deforming movements. And that he doesn't explicitly say it in that paragraph, but it seems to me that he's kind of calling for us to remember what it was like to be formed as embryos, when the cellular sort of topology as we were taking form was indeed, we were going through a rotating, shearing, deforming movement, and that we can recollect that, and that it's remembering this whole embryogenetic process that allows us to begin to perceive this very different kind of topology that's at play in the heavenly spheres around us. So yeah, that's kind of a fragmented series of thoughts that hopefully makes sense, but I'm struggling through to the glimpses of light that I see into what Steiner's trying to describe.
That's great. It reminds me of what Max was saying. He actually does literally say at one point, if we project ourselves back into the embryonic development or something like that. But when Max was suggesting this connection between the shaping of space and the activity of the gods to participate, I guess project back into embryogenesis is kind of like participating in that activity.
Yeah. And just to see embryogenesis as not just something that is occurring because of the forces present, say the chemistry and the genes and whatever present within the embryo itself and within the womb, but that's actually a reflection of a much larger process, just like the compass needle. You can't explain the movements of the compass needle based just on what's going on inside the compass. You can't explain the growth of form from beyond space into space just by reference to what's going on in the simply located container of the womb.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a real key to imaginatively or experientially grasping those different kinds of activities or basically exercise of the will between what we're used to, which is will that our limbs radiate outward from a central point, and so that's like the linear radial exercise of the will. But before we were born, our will you have to undergo or try to undertake an inversion or a reversal. So imagine that the will is actually operating not radially outward, but rather inward from the periphery, from all sides. And then you realize at that point in the will, what you call your individual will is a function of that experience of radial will. When before we were born, our will was actually something like a collaboration. It wasn't exclusive. It wasn't individually ours. It wasn't exclusively ours. It was like a collaboration with actual gods. And that still continues to go. It's basically sustains our life force while we're alive, but our consciousness is it's a central consciousness. But I think the transition to the etheric consciousness has to do with that inversion from the point outward radially and turning that inside out. Then you're looking in from all sides rather than looking out towards all sides.
That's great. It just reminds me of this one, I guess, aspect of looking at metamorphosis in the world and all its permutations on Earth, that we see these various expressions of internalization, and that incarnation, it's a kind of internalization and individuation of that peripheral, like kind of symphonic will. And then, as Max was just describing, like that maybe our evolutionary trajectory is to individually like will our consciously participate with that peripheral will again, or I guess for the first time. Rosemary?
I don't know if people have been doing this, cross-reference to other works by Steiner, but there's a couple of lectures in this series called Spiritual Science as a Foundation for Social Forms, lectures 10 and 11. He's talking about this phenomena using the language centripetal and centrifugal. So here's one of the illustrations. And what he says here is the gods only come into contact with the centripetally working world through the human being. So coming in from the outside are beings exercising centripetal effects. And I think that's what Max was getting at, is that the human being is the platform where the conversion of where the centripetal meets the centrifugal, and doing it with more precise consciousness feeds the gods and feeds human evolution in a positive direction. That's all I wanted to, if you want the GA number, I'll put it in the chat.
Sure, that's great. I was just rereading a part of Saving the Appearances, and Barfield describes the human as the theater, or something, kind of just reminded me of the word that you used to describe the human as the kind of conduit for that activity. Jeff?
Hey, y'all. I haven't had a lot to say in this process, you might notice. This is a very strange set of lectures from Rudolf Steiner. I don't know of anything like it. There's something similar. Angus and I are working through Christianity as a mystical fact, and there's something similar about the conservative nature of the way in which he's approaching this in a very contemporary sense. So there's something mysterious going on here, and this is why I can't quite speak, besides it being rather difficult for somebody who has an Americanized education and was able to avoid mathematics at all costs. Sorry, Gopi, wherever you are. I have a question, I think, and seems to be a key to this somehow. And it's a notion that is also in physics, and I'm also experiencing a sort of parallel. It's like he's doing physics the way it's supposed to be done, or somehow, you know. But but I have the question, when he brings up the notion of first order and second order and moving from quantity into quality, does anybody have thoughts on that? Like what is the actual operational procedure? I didn't understand it, that leads one from quantity to quality. You know, it's said in physics that enough quantity turns into quality, and enough quality turns into quantity. Something I'm sure I butchered the concept, but does it have to do with that? And I'm also, Rosemary, I'm glad you brought in spiritual science as a foundation for spiritual science foundation for social forms, because in it he refers to the need to remember our life before birth, and this also calls up Stanislav Grof a little bit in the perinatal experience. And one wonders, is it possible? And is that what is that the working of imagination, as you and I and Barfield might understand it? So those are sort of slightly disconnected, vague statements of my own weird sense of something just bordering on a language that I understand that I don't understand. And maybe it would help to unlock this first order and second order concept that he brings, and the formulaic way in which he brings it.
Thanks, Jeff. I also avoided mathematics, and so I have a hard time with that part as well. So thank you for asking that question. Lorenzo, maybe you and Karsten are gonna take those up.
Yeah, I will try to answer this question. I think that metric is an important word here to distinguish between quantity and quality, and the way that Steiner is looking at it. I mean, I think Steiner here is trying to do something that physics usually doesn't do. That is, I don't think that's true that physics in the modern sense of the term says that enough quality makes up quantity. That's a more philosophical statement, something you would expect from a Hegel or somebody like that, or a Marxist, let's say. While modern physics doesn't accept that. Modern physics disregards quality altogether because it's not metrical. That is, you cannot measure it. But this talk about geometry, the difference between projective geometry and Euclidean geometry refers to that. That is, projective geometry is not metrical. You cannot measure things out of a projective rendition of them. You have, to get at least at least a set of projective images to determine from, let's say, Euclidean geometry, like when you do an orthogonal projection or something like that, or you have to go there and put another object like a meter that measures the other object, because you see that they match, but through your eyes only you cannot measure up stuff. You don't have the right geometry, because if I take this box of cigarette and I turn it this way, that it seems smaller than it looks if I look it this way, and all the degrees you have in between, you get this effect, and you would not be able to measure me, because you would say that my hand is bigger than my head. and so projective geometry is not metrical. And I think that this kind of images that I showed you last time too are important to understand the relationship between the usual Cartesian way and this kind of counter space that he's getting at. And what is, I think, relevant in this image is that, we were talking about the length that it takes for, or the time that it takes for light to reach a certain point following a curve. And that we have difficulties in imagining how something that is a force that is not centralized would work, that's a force that's peripheric. How can I think about something that is not pushing me? It's not just centrifugal, but it's actually peripherically sucking me in all directions. This image is cool because you see that if you imagine those curvy lines to be the shortest distances, you see that from this point to this point, you can take routes that are actually much shorter than some others, because if you take this route that comes back here, it's actually infinite. But take as a hypothesis that they are all the same. That is, this point is receiving the force, the sucking force from all directions with the same strength. This point, which is the infinitely distant sphere, becomes a point that you can treat. You can imagine this as, let's say, a vacuum or a sucking void, like a sucking void, and here you get instead a source. You think of stuff moving, energy, force moving from one pole to the other, and that's something that can help you imagine the peripheral forces. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Karsten?
Yeah, can you allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, is it not enabled here? Okay,
No, it's not enabled.
there we go.
Yeah.
I think you should be able to now.
Okay, so I was, can you see this now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking a little about the mathematics that he was talking about, and just without any kind of interpretation, just trying to follow his lead. And he was talking about this thing that you have these two parameters for the Cassini curve, and then you can make one of these two parameters a function of the other, and then you get some kind of higher order function, is the phrase that he's using. And it's in this context that he's talking about that you can have a continuous quantitative change, which at the same time is a change from quantitative to qualitative, something like that. So if I make an animation here, you can see I have drawn a Cassini curve. So I have the equation for the Cassini curve, and then I have these two parameters A and B. They can be changed, but they change in such a way that A is 3 times the square root of B. So the green line, you see the green curve is this function 3 times the square root of B, but here I just call it X. I had to call it X in this program. So if I start the animation here, you can see that on the green curve, you have a continuous quantitative change, which at the same time, when you look at the Cassini curve, it leads into some qualitative changes, because here, for example, it changes from continuous to discontinuous, and now it's discontinuous, and now we enter back into the domain of a continuous curve. So I just simply followed here what Steiner presented as a thought experiment and trying to implement it in this program here. So that helped me to try to understand what he was talking about when he was talking about this, the fact that some quantitative change somehow also could lead to a qualitative change. Yeah. Let's see if I can stop this again. I always have problems when I want to stop. It stops share. It's there. Okay, you helped me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for that visual. Corey?
Yeah, hey guys, what's going on? Corey. So Ashton, I thought it was interesting. It is Ashton, right? By the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I came in just last week, right? And so I read the intro, right? And then chapter 1 and then chapter 10. You mentioned how it's almost like a mid-lecture or like a catching up to where everything was. And I thought it was interesting, right? So mentioned on it's right around figure 4, right on page 153, with all that's present in your consciousness in connection with what you see around you through the senses, even as far away as the stars, right? And so this is pretty basic, but back in page 1, he talked about the ancient Egyptians, right? And how they were guided, how they saw things in the heavens and whatnot, and really had their whole social life that were really wrapped around that and whatnot, and brings back to ancient China, Babylonian, right? The Greeks, Sumerians, all doing that as well. And this is sort of layman's, but I want to hear what everyone has to say, right? When you think of the science behind like zodiac signs or the horoscope, right? That type of a thing. I mean, for me, it was impossible to not at least just think of that, and that might be, bringing to, I don't want to insult anyone, right, or bring anything down, but didn't know if anybody knew, some of the astrology or the science behind that, or if there's even like different names to be used for that, or if I, where I think I'll just stop there and see if anybody has some thoughts.
You mean different names for like constellations or?
No, just you know how like you'll do your horoscope, right, or your zodiac signs, and some people really get behind, right, that type of thing. I wouldn't be one to have done that or have really dug into that space or whatnot in the past, but I mean I know there's a ton of math that goes into it, right, the lining up of the planets, right, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't know if anybody just had any thoughts on that. I could not bring it up,
No, I think it's great. And I think probably most people here are at least pro astrology, if not practitioners. So yeah, no, I think that's definitely relevant. It's nice to have you touching back to the beginning of the lecture cycle. And with that, what he mentioned in the beginning of the lecture cycle, that one of the aspirations of this lecture cycle is to connect this participatory astronomy with social sociology, and yeah, referring to the Egyptians and this maybe social organization that reflected a deep wisdom of the sky. Chad, do you have any thoughts about this? Chad is our resident astrologer, maybe among others that I'm not aware of. Any thoughts, Chad?
Yeah, good morning. I am preparing for a reading here in the next 10 minutes, so I'm not ready to engage with you guys. But absolutely, there's deep astrological correlations being referenced here. And honestly, I think he's describing what we need to be doing in order to come into relationship with the archetypes. The archetypes are the fundamental ground of reality, and astrology is a map, a methodology of engaging with those beings. And I believe he's giving us really nuanced kind of understanding or insight into how to actually engage with them. I'll have more to say next week. Yeah, so definitely you're right on time. And with the perinatal, Jeff, absolutely. You can remember your birth and all different qualities about it ultimately I think all the way back from conception to delivery, it's possible that those actual experiences are present either in your organism or in the collective unconscious. So they are there to be accessed. Absolutely.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
Rosemary?
Thanks, sir.
I really do want to tap Chad. I was thinking that Chad should have been at the meeting on Thursday where we looked at the tarot card, where there was so much going on archetypally. But I just wanted to check back in with Karsten and Lorenzo on this, and trying, maybe this is my way of maybe answering Jeff Barney's question about what does it mean to move from first order to second order in mathematics, because Lorenzo showed us a model that he was holding in his hands of the boy's structure, and part of it was sliced away, so you could see the slices as the size changes slightly, getting bigger or smaller, the equation would slightly change. And then Karsten showed us something similar with the animation. What is it? Is that what it means to move from first to second in mathematics, second order?
I'm not sure I fully understand you. You mean that the relative dimension of the stripes, because the stripes are just an artifact to let you see through the surface.
The steps, the steps or the phases would be the movement, and is that a way of describing quantity into quality?
No, I think that the whole topological field is all qualitative. What would you say, Karsten? Would you agree with this definition?
I think there are more things. For example, when you look at these Cassini curves, you can see that you have different qualities. For example, when it comes discontinuous, that's kind of another quality than when it's a continuous curve. And I think the green line I had, the green curve I had in my animation, in that curve, each point actually represents a particular parameterization of the Cassini curve. So in a sense, each point on this green curve represents a particular quality that you cannot see from the green curve, but if you know what is lying underneath, you can experience it as different qualities. So I think that's part of what he means by higher order or second order, the fact that you can have a function on top of another function. So there's some kind of hidden reality beneath the apparent curve. If I only showed you the green curve with a point going back and forth, you wouldn't know what it was about, but actually each point represents a particular parameterization of the Cassini curves.
One other way to look at it is once again you can think about the distances as from one point to the other as one possible distance. You can measure it and say, okay, it's 20, let's say, squares away from the other. But if you look at the curves, instead you get very different measures, and so you're losing the metric aspect, the quantitative aspect. You cannot speak about a quantity for the length of these lines, and I think that's the abyss, let's say. And another way of looking at it more gradually, if one doesn't just think from projective geometry to Euclidean geometry, but takes affine and centro-affine geometries as steps that are actually involved in the mathematical transformation. I mean, they're not arbitrarily. There is something that you do. When you do a three-dimensional rendition, a perspectival rendition of an image that is per se projective, you cannot simply transform the projective image directly into the Euclidean model. You have to go through these intermediate geometries, and there you start getting measures, that is, through the transformations, some values remained fixed. For example, volumes, or then the angles, and lastly also the lengths measures, and so that the measures of the lengths, and so there you get a full Euclidean geometry. But there are these intermediate steps, and they are linked to what we feel we represent as gas, liquid, or solid, and that's something that's very qualitative. So I think that the relationship between quantity and quality is rather complex, at least as Steiner is trying to build this bridge between one and the other through geometry. Mm-hmm. And that the fact that the states of matter, the main qualities of ancient philosophy, are directly linked to this 4 different geometries you can use to measure your experience. I think it's like the trace of an intertwinement or some kind of recursion, like in the bodies or in the planes or the ethers that we talked about. And so probably it's not just quantity to quality, but it's a back and forth that builds on the final way we represent our realities as we create space. Yeah.
Go ahead, Karsten.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lorenzo, and I think that's one thing I think is interesting here is that when you move from Euclidean geometry to projective geometry, in the Euclidean geometry, you abstract totally from the observer, whereas when you move into the projective geometry, the observer is not present in the picture, but it's kind of a point at infinity that is somehow there. So you have what you call a principle of context.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I've been very much interested in. For example, in Frege's philosophy, he introduces this context principle in relation to the semantics of words, that you can only understand a word in the context of a sentence. And for example, Wittgenstein builds upon that. So Wittgenstein's principle of, say, language games as something that inform the meaning of a sentence or a word, at some place Wittgenstein says that the meaning of a word depends on its place in life or something like that, or its role in life. I can't remember it exactly, but I think Steiner is touching upon that as well, that when he's talking about these forces from the periphery, he's talking about the way that context informs and affects any kind of object that we have and in our own lives and so on. So I think that's very important part as well.
Yeah, there's a spatial relation. I mean, there's a relationship between the difference between Sinn and Bedeutung, meaning, sense and meaning, that Frege discovered, and the relationship with the outside, and so with the representation of space itself. what is inside, what is outside. Also, intentionality, the fact that you always have an object of your attention. It's always you're always conscious of something. This characteristic of consciousness, of being consciousness of something, is something that could be related to metabolism, to nutrition, because Steiner, I think he says here, yeah, what for the plant is food becomes perception, because we take the plant into ourself, it becomes our eyes, and so we use the plant nutrition as perception. Like we see colors because colors are food, and there's this grabbing quality of consciousness, this intentionality that keeps the mark of nutrition, of this relationship of inside and outside, and getting the two things into a dynamical relationship. And yeah, I had one last thing to say. But it will come to me.
Next time, Lorenzo.
Next time. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. This was really rich today. And we'll continue with lecture 11 in a week. Our time here in California will be changing, moving an hour ahead on Sunday. So we'll be back, for those of you in Europe, to the usual timing for you. So, and thanks again, Alex, for alerting us to this bizarre asymmetric change. I wish we were lined up, but all right, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.